All right, my fellow adventurers, this is episode 15 of World Solution Writing Process Podcast. This episode is going to be about how the movement grows over time. I have about 63 pages of a chapter written in a total scramble, so I have to warn you that this section will be very disorganized, and I will return to and repeat this topic later. I'm just going to do a one-off introducing it at first, but I gotta warn you, it's gonna be kind of a wild ride. It's just a lot of nuts and bolts organizing, because when I think through this whole idea of building a parallel government on the basis of some kind of democratic or multi-party socialism, organizing anti-government protests, and contending to flip the pillars of the security state and state administration from the capitalist government to the parallel government, or arguably you could use this, say, for example, in Russia, to realign the state pillars from the dictatorship to a democratic parallel government. For example, the Congress of People's Deputies, which is a government in exile, as well as a parallel government. In the Russian context, the thing of it is, at some point, someone's going to ask you, okay, what's the first thing we do? If we're implementing this wild strategy, if we're going on this wild ride with you, what is step one? And to quote Linkin Park, it starts with one. It starts with you. You may have to start a whole movement just from yourself. There are a million tactics. Like Gene Sharp in his book has a list of 198 tactics you can use nonviolently to overthrow a government or achieve any other change. So anyway, I would say you start with a combination of education and entertainment. To start the notes, that's the first line of my notes. You need to liven people's spirits, bring them around, but we're also doing something pretty complex here. So the education part is study groups, discussion groups, talks, podcasts, blogs, essays, pamphlets, books, movie showings, film screenings. That's big. So anyway, moving on from that, combine that with performance art, entertainment, open mics, or free shows, living room shows, stuff like that. Some initial first steps for this entire movement. So in my conception, the 1, 2, 3, 4 first steps include step 1, gather a discussion group about the theory and strategy of parallel government and socialist history in general, revolutionary history, just the theory and history and strategy of parallel government, discussion group. Step 2, begin simulations of a parallel government by basically doing role play sessions of a revolutionary legislature. And you can alternate between the scenario of a government that's just taken power and the scenario, my preferred scenario, of a government that is actually just starting out, like a pure realism scenario where you're building a revolutionary government from like the people in your living room or on a Skype call, and you're just going in turn order. Everyone makes a proposal on their turn, vote it up and down, deliberate, and then you can LARP a street action declaring your declarations at the end. Step 3 is where instead of a role play or a simulation, you begin to actually form a parallel government, which in some ways will be indistinguishable from the simulations, except it's just sort of about whether you treat it as real or you treat it as practice. And every session is a rehearsal, every session is practice, but there's a distinction between ones that really count and ones that don't. That's really the only distinction between step 2 and 3, is how you approach it. And then finally, step 4 is outreach, which includes things like individual recruiting, direct outreach to other groups, and street actions, small street actions. And my initial idea for a model of small street actions is basically a micro march where you take a small number of people and you have a very short march route and you march around stopping at multiple places, repeating and reciting the same declaration. First, a general declaration denouncing the legitimacy of the current government and calling for the installation of your parallel government. And then possibly also reading from the list of legislation that you've accumulated during your legislative sessions. So that's really the first 4 or maybe 5 steps. Oh, by the way, it should be a noise demonstration. People bang on pots and pans, but not a hostile noise demonstration where you're like getting right up in the cops' faces, more like just a general like enunciatory noise demonstration. Also a birthday party aesthetic, just for silliness and levity, can help take some of the edge off of you literally marching through the street declaring a revolutionary government. Kind of an intense thing. Step 1, discussion group. Step 2, parallel government simulation. Step 3, parallel government formation and sessions. Step 4, outreach, including individual recruitment, outreach to other groups, and small actions, including
a mini march, noise demo, birthday party aesthetic with multiple stops, repeating a declaration, general declaration of opposition to the government, and reciting a list of legislation.
Okay, it's time for some alliteration with the letter M. Measure movements by membership magnitude from single digits to tens of millions, multi-million at minimum, to achieve change of government. You may have to literally start with yourself, clarify to yourself, and communicate. Okay, backing up. For those who are just jumping in and don't really know what this podcast is, this is my writing process. I'm trying to write a book that will allow the overthrow of global capitalism in the short-term future, to provide a strategic framework for that. That's quite a task. So I'm writing a book that answers the question of how to do that and why that is possible and also desirable. But the thing of it is, I wrote all my notes in sort of non-linear Deleuze and Guattari style stream of consciousness, and I'm trying to organize them. And that's very hard for me to do because there's a lot of notes, possibly 700 pages at this point. So I'm trying to get a book down to like somewhere in the 150, 250 range of pages. And that's going to take a lot of editing and narrowing down and everything. So this is the chapter, only a part of the chapter of my notes for the chapter called How the Movement Grows Over Time. Back to what I was saying. You may have to literally start with yourself, clarify to yourself and communicate the points of unity you are organizing around, and recruit others, at first, to yourself. You may have to be the founding member of a revolutionary organization and suffer the hilarious disgrace of being a one-person revolutionary organization for a time. Quite seriously, this is where self-organization is really critical. It's hard to organize others without having your own life at least somewhat organized. As a lone member, you may have to recruit people by being some kind of solo performance artist, nothing more shameful. At least you'll keep yourself entertained in the meantime. Maybe you'll have to go into performance art like music or comedy. You don't need numbers to feel like your actions are worth doing. Your support will materialize as you take action. It will at times be necessary to build the movement by throwing events whose sole purpose is fun. Every rebellion is a rehearsal for future rebellions. In a certain sense, organizing is a human resources task, but that end can be easily handled by either using a spreadsheet or a digital service like Nation Builder. The key to organizing is to see every individual as a government or nation state, all interaction between individuals as diplomacy, and to see organizing as a form of geopolitical coalition building transplanted to the individual and social level. Build your alliance. In a certain sense, every strategy includes the strategy of attrition, which is the simple accumulation of forces over time. No matter your plan, you'll probably need people, which means street actions, social events, pamphleteering, tabling, group meditation, whatever, like any boring reformist movement. Habits and routines are human automation. We must automate ourselves partially to save mental energy, but must not automate ourselves totally, or we become dogmatic, unresponsive robots. Maybe I'll get 10 pages into this and call it. It could possibly take a color... Oh man, this is so sad. I'm reading my notes from back when Bernie was still running. It could possibly take a color revolution to get Bernie's legislation past Congress, even if Bernie was president. That's funny. There may need to be some kind of color revolution against Donald Trump if he is reelected. Just saying. You could build a functioning crew of 20 street participants, run trainings like show people how to start a revolution, and then give a talk about this kind of stuff. You could run a parallel government in person in some nearby city. Just hang out, have fun, keep yourself alive. Once established, you can involve other groups. You can spread your agenda within various coalitions. Potential allies would include Bernie supporters, various democratic socialists, various other socialists, maybe Extinction Rebellion, maybe everyone and everything. Bob Helvey, a military figure who started participating in Gene Sharp's movements, had something called a momentum curve, where in the first half of the movement you're building momentum, and in the second half of the movement you're maintaining momentum. Depending how big you scale, at some point you might build a protest by taking out newspaper or radio ads like ACT UP has done. ACT UP, I believe, is an AIDS awareness organization in New York City. There's an ACT UP civil disobedience guide. It says, shifting to the next stage does not mean activities at earlier levels should always be forgotten. Going from picketing to a sit-in does not necessarily mean picketing should be discontinued. As you build a movement like this, in the beginning you may be a guerrilla protester doing small, even tiny and minuscule actions to help draw initial recruits and give the group some photo opportunities. You may have to persevere in this state for some time, and the best approach to this would be creativity. Every street action could be an entirely new street theater, costume theme or musical act, public meditation, flash mob, or other creative and unconventional tactics to encourage engagement. Some events may be so fun that people want to repeat them. You can do things like labor organizing or progressive election campaigns, but you'd better keep one foot in that and the other foot firmly grounded in revolutionary theory. Our mistake is to believe we need to water down our message to get the masses in the streets, then radicalize from there. The issue is that's already been done, and the masses have already been in the streets plenty. The paradox is that it's precisely revolution which actually gets the mass turnout, yet many revolutionaries are afraid to organize protests about revolution because they're, quote, irrelevant, when they're actually far more relevant and mass participatory than protests around reform demands. If you're doing local work, it makes sense to reach out to the authorities to see if they'll simply implement your proposal upon request. It happens sometimes. However, in the case of national authorities that have been systemically hostile and neglectful for decades, no negotiation or outreach is needed, only pressure. You can raise reform demands of the national authorities without expecting they be met, raising them more as part of the platform of your revolutionary movement than having any real expectation the authorities will grant them. Yes, being cynical about the chances of universal healthcare happening in the United States without some kind of popular revolution is just the realism that comes with an anti-capitalist analysis of the state and awareness of recent American history. Many great revolutionists went through phases of being ignored, hated, or both by the public, or even by their own movement. Don't worry about it. People are often silly. Keep leading them to reason. To meet new people, it makes sense to get situationist. You can form an absurdist choir that just walks around the streets making silly noises, vocally and or instrumentally, and inviting passers-by to join in making silly random noises. It's therapeutic. Essentially, the idea is you can use DIY art and performance to draw a crowd around yourself and then deliver a political message aimed toward recruitment. An example would be, if you were in a band, don't just have band shirts at your merch table, have organizational literature in a sign-up sheet. You can extend this model to being a solo performer or whatever. Honestly, just do whatever makes you happy and turn it into a social thing, sometimes, as a method of political outreach. Positive accelerationism. It's a reaffirmation of the Marxist belief that action is more persuasive than communication, but also that collective action is more persuasive than individual action. Small actions help orient society toward an issue, allowing for future large protest waves and media focus on that issue. Take pictures of everything you do, including tabling. Use them to promote yourself on social media. The movement grows from city takeovers to a national provisional government, though not necessarily in that order. The national provisional government may have existed a long time beforehand. The critical question is whether and when it begins gaining public support. And in some cases, it makes more sense to say national parallel government if it's a long-term thing. In a certain sense, every individual can be thought of as a pillar, and the first pillar to flip is you. You must embrace this strategy and believe in yourself as a person capable of individually spearheading it. Regime change tends to happen at the scale of nations. It requires taking actions capable of getting national attention, often civil disobedience. This will require navigating some of the eccentric personalities who populate the protest scene. You can use sports fan bases for the biggest and main sports like football, American and international, as social basis for recruitment. You can protest around the price of consumer goods, demanding price controls. This has been effective in Europe and should have been going on during COVID in the United States. Just as a movement is organized by campaigns, so does the movement also progress from small non-arrestable protests to small arrestable civil disobedience actions over time to medium and larger protests, then large-scale civil disobedience. Though for a frictionless movement, civil disobedience can be mostly or entirely avoided and replaced with laftivism. Through education, we can develop cadre of people who are color revolution experts, who are crowd revolution experts. We can pull pillars rather than push them. Pushing the pillars is like a riot where you demoralize the police by beating them up. You can pull the pillars by creating a festive atmosphere. Or instead, you can be professional, spiritual, moderate, or ordinary. For example, there are many civil disobedience protesters who are religious figures, and that can give an aura of protection to your actions. At times, it may make sense to pick alliances, organizing some actions only with fellow anti-capitalist groups and other actions including liberals, depending. Black Lives Matter started from a civil disobedience action at Mall of America. The Seattle World Trade Organization protests and Occupy Wall Street were all just planned beforehand by a coalition of multiple groups around an issue with wide popularity, planning a civil disobedience. These movements absolutely didn't remain completely nonviolent, but they started that way, and nonviolence was what most participants observed in practice. More importantly, if a large crowd is what you want, this is how you get it, and gathering a large crowd is often more important than whether there is violence. social events, benefit shows, refocus existing protests toward immediate regime change, hold street actions, hold your own street actions, denounce the current government, proclaim and promote a new government, use the slogans of regime change. Like in the Middle East, it was the people demand removal of the regime. Here, it might be down with Congress, install a socialist government, arrest Congress, remove Congress. But always distinguish yourself from the January 6th crowd when you do this, politically. Obviously, the main catch of this book is that these are all fine ideas, but you yourself are going to have to recruit others to joining you in these activities. You absolutely cannot do it completely alone, unless you're planning a robot coup, in which case, please continue your efforts, because those little ground drones with those tiny little treads, like a tank, really are as cute as a button. It's good to do research on issues, because sometimes people protest the status quo without knowing what it even really is. Building your revolutionary organization involves leading the struggle. However, don't lead the struggle by just trying to participate or be influential in the prevailing trends. Lead the struggle by starting small and doing the things the rest of the movement isn't doing yet, but desperately needs to be doing. Lead the struggle by organizing for regime change, forming a parallel government, and holding demonstrations demanding regime change as well as redistribution. The revolution won't build itself, we must build it ourselves. It won't spontaneously appear if we build reform movements. We must build a revolutionary movement as its own distinct movement. Recruiting targets include ordinary people, workers regardless of union membership, but also union members, non-voters, democratic voters, punks, and socialists. Okay, so I've got a little James Cannon here. He's a crotchety old Trotskyist. Let's see what he has to say. He kept advising me all the time. This is James Cannon, one of the founders of American Trotskyism. Really the founder. He kept advising me all the time about the problems of leadership. As far back as 1935 and 1936, in the fight with the Mustites and the Ullerites, he gave us such advice. He always referred to Lenin, how Lenin had put his cadre together. He said Lenin would take one man who had an impulse for action, smelled opportunities and had a tendency to run ahead of himself, and balance him off against a man who was a little more cautious. And the compromise between the two got a balanced decision, which redounded to the benefit of the party. And Lenin used to say, as Trotsky explained it to me, we need Kamenev in the Central Committee because his tendency to waver and conciliate is the reflection of a certain tendency of that kind in the party ranks that we want to keep our finger on. When Kamenev speaks, we know that there is a certain sentiment within the party of the same kind that we have to take into consideration. And while we do not accept Kamenev's wavering and conciliationism, we go slow and take it into account because when we move, we want to take the whole party with us. If he raises too many objections, we stop a while and devote a little more time to education in the party ranks to make sure that our ranks will be solid. In a color revolution organization, it's probably more about balancing the theoretical people and the creative people, with both firmly needed. Instead of affording nice organizational shirts, you can get a bunch of really cheap oversized shirts in the color of your movement to begin spreading the aesthetic. I'm talking about printing costs. Some organizations make t-shirts, it costs money. And instead of doing t-shirts or dealing with screen printing, which can be a hassle, or paying to get shirts printed, you can just pick a color and everyone wear a shirt of the same color, and that will give you aesthetic unity even without much cost. Or you can just get really cheap shirts that are all the same color for really cheap and hand them out, and that can help you achieve the aesthetic unity of the movement. So the movement should hold street actions in major cities, but the organizers should have an edge city mentality. The major city left is often the biggest perpetrator of senseless trends within the movement which prevent success, such as insistence on maximum violence or maximum identity politics. It might make sense to have affiliated bands. No one really feels like doing all that boring legwork of building a movement anyway. Sometimes maybe the movement should just be partying and training if conditions on the street are too complicated. Sometimes it's hard to protest literally just because of all the drama and conflict in the protest movement, with the movement's own conflicts acting as a repressive force, discouraging protest almost as much as state repression. All planning is engineering. A plan is like a machine that needs all the parts working together. It's okay to create an energetic atmosphere in your organizing, just don't start giving out Kool-Aid laced with cyanide like the Jim Jones cult. Edge cities aren't so much the edge between city and country as the edge between city and suburbs. Edge cities are probably the sweet spot, both for comfort of living as well as politics independent of both urban liberalism and urban ultra-left nonsense, as well as independent from rural conservatism and fascism. They place you within striking distance of major cities for planning or attending demonstrations without forcing you to endure the toxic, hyper-competitive backbiting and gossip of the urban activist and music scene and environment. From an edge city, you can choose to recruit from major cities or from the edge city itself. It's a great place to start new things from scratch or from yourself. You are never starting from scratch. At worst, you are always starting from yourself. This is one of the most important things to remember. It is not unmaterialist to start from yourself. You are material. To an extent, the protest movement is something in which we must participate, but something we are also protesting against itself. The focus on reform demands needs to shift to revolutionary demonstrations, whose main demand is socialist regime change itself. This is highly advanced, and to wage this struggle of persuasion, you will have to be ready to face a lot of resistance and rejection from the reform movement while making these points. But if you persist, you can make some headway, and it can build on itself. The classic anti-capitalist protest model is to organize or attend protests around reform issues, but use these as a chance to mobilize and meet a larger and wider array of people than those who would attend something more vanguard, like a rally for a revolutionary government. I go into my music tastes. Aesthetic is part of concrete organizing, though don't overdo it. Power noise is the people's beat. It's popular during years of big optimistic uprisings like 1999 and 2011. It includes bands like Terrorfact, Imminent Starvation, Orphex, People's Republic of Europe, Waste, and Ontal. In 2011, Gesaffelstein was bordering on power noise. May 2024 be another big year of power noise. Power noise is like, you could say it's drum and bass turned all the way toward brutality, or you could say it's industrial turned all the way towards brutality and danceability. It's like where drum and bass meets industrial, but turned all the way up. Kind of like how where metal meets punk is hardcore, but where metal meets punk turned all the way up is grindcore. You might think it sounds absurd that most revolutions, even violent revolutions, mostly revolve around or begin through crowd protest. You might think of protest as passive, as begging from the system, etc. The reality remains, successful socialist movements in old and recent revolutionary history have had a strong component of street protest or popular protest. Protest is often a political embarrassment for any government targeted by it. It disrupts traffic and occupies social space. It destroys the illusion that no one is displeased. Rather than passive, it represents a considerable sacrifice of time, energy, and transit costs for the ordinary people who participate. Even for the lower petty bourgeois activists, it's demanding. There's also a lot of drama in the protest scene most people would rather avoid. Protests are called demonstrations because they literally demonstrate that people are upset enough to not just whine, not just vote, but actually show up somewhere in physical material reality and expend the energy of their bodies in that exercise. Protests are also called mobilizations because gathering any number of people at a specific time and place truly is a flex of your power. Mobilization is often a term for military recruitment. Half of building an army is arms, but the other half is just coordinating people together, and protest possesses the building blocks of this coordination. If you give a crowd guns, it becomes a militia. Unsurprisingly, many participants in nonviolent protest movements sometimes later end up in more violent movements or in civil wars. This doesn't mean you should. It's just one more reason the system regards protest as a real threat. Even without this aspect, the power of protest to disrupt business as usual, simply by occupying physical space, is very real. Everything feels impossible and pointless when you start small, but most things start small, especially things that get big. There was a parable in the Bible. Jesus said something about how a mustard seed is the very smallest of seeds, but from that seed grows the very largest of trees. You may have a better time talking to moderates than liberals or anarchists, or other socialists. Everyone knows that serious politics happens at the scale of millions, and if a group isn't on a trajectory for that scale, people often just won't participate. The key is to persevere in growing while still being ignored for initial smallness. The way to set yourself on that trajectory is not to compromise and water yourself down to a primary focus on reform demands or labor concessions, but a primary focus on organizing around the demand of a new government, a socialist government. We must infiltrate the cities for the way that their massed population makes them central to protest, but resist the backward preoccupations of the urban left by basing ourselves in the edge cities or small major cities. We must always remember that the urban working class is a silent majority who is not very interested in the urban left. The values of the urban working class are probably closer to a suburban, not rural, perspective than your typical urban liberal or ultra-leftist would ever want to admit. It's the liberals who are over-civilized, not the average urban resident who is more based and down to earth. At some point, you just have to disrupt capitalism now. We can stage sit-ins blocking the entrances of the investment banks that are buying up all the housing and driving up the price. Resist, pass it along. In their beginnings, all movements depend on this kind of replicating simple meme. Many movements now have very hashtagable names: Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter. Every revolutionary organization is inevitably plagued by dysfunction for having to work in an environment of capitalism without the resource advantages of a business or government organization. Revolutionary organizations also have to function in environments opposed to their own politics. The question is not how we get liberals and anarchists to become Marxist, but whether we can convince them to go along with the label of revolutionary democratic socialism for the sake of unit cohesion, and whether we can convince them to support a revolutionary government. If we can do that, the Marxism will probably spontaneously follow. This doesn't mean we shouldn't do Marxist education. Ultimately, our support will come from our own base, which in the United States, for example, would be the 1/3 of the population which already identifies with socialism rather than capitalism in opinion polls. A lot of these people seem to be Democrats, while others are non-voters, and very few are Republicans. Many are young. This means, or at least millennials. This means in the USA, the socialist base is partially liberal and partially non-voter. It's a split between people who vote for the lesser evil parties and the people who vote for no party. The way to build a movement like this would be by encouraging people to read this text, begin conversations and discussion groups about it, and holding screenings of color revolution movies like Bringing Down a Dictator or How to Start a Revolution, as well as videos and documentaries about introductory Marxism. If a video of this book gets made, screen that as well. From there, you start a revolutionary organization and a revolutionary government, either as the same group or two overlapping groups, or one as a committee of the other. The transition from discussion to action has to be organic, so it makes more sense to perform these initial tasks of education before rushing into street actions. Street actions should revolve around universal housing, healthcare, and basic income as immediate redistributive demands. Actually, no, I go a little harder than this. Sometimes I contradict myself within the text, and my actual opinion is that at this point, the primary focus and slogan should be demanding a socialist government and demanding removal of Congress, which should be supported by demands for universal housing, healthcare, and basic income. So I'm going to edit below. Regime change comes first, redistribution comes second in terms of ranking priorities and prioritization. So anyway, we issue our demands to a dual audience. One audience is the system, as we would gladly support if they passed major redistributive legislation themselves. And the other audience is not any established authority, but simply the people themselves. Demands are not always about demanding things from the state, but about helping the people share a vision of what we should be demanding, and the new laws that should be enacted not by this government, but a future revolutionary government which we the people will bring about and can begin building now. I'm going to call it there. As you can tell, my voice is a little bit hoarse, but I got through 10 pages of my notes, which is pretty good for me and my episodes. It's not too long of an episode, so that's good. I know my enthusiasm of delivery was perhaps not as lively as it has been in some past episodes, but I appreciate you listening. This has been World Solution Writing Process, episode 15 on How the Movement Grows Over Time, part 1. Signing off.